Okay, so today we'll be diving deeper into adaptive composition techniques, which is in some sense the title or the topic of the class. But really, this is kind of the highlight of what's going on today in creating or composing music for computer games, or even as we started the discussion in the introduction in class one, is this concept of music as something dynamic that can be responsive to events outside of the music itself. And I think this is kind of an exciting opportunity for generative arts in general to be more responsive and adaptive. The idea that you can have these artificial intelligence agents and that communicate and either augment your creativity or allow you to use music in environments which you couldn't have you know, had access before that, right? So any kind of augmented reality, virtual reality that comes not only with virtual graphics but with sound, it has to respond to something that happens outside of the music. So music becomes a dynamic thing. Uh, and the techniques are evolving, and I think this is a very exciting field for research. Um, so we kind of mentioned what adaptive music is, as I said right up front when we started with this class, but this time it's a good opportunity to go a little bit more in detail and speak about some, I wouldn't say best practice, but like technical ways of how you could approach an adaptive composition technique. And so the main thing about this task is that it needs to be coordinated. The music has to be coordinated with something outside. In this case, the game design and the user actions. Now, since there is no like set method for doing this, um, um, both technically and artistically, it's full of new ideas. But I would say the main concepts are that once you have enough materials, you want to find some way of organizing them. Uh, and the organizational principles could be, of course, related to what we did so far, mood or inspiration for the scene. In the assignments, we actually explored intentionally kind of different genres, right? We started with chiptune, and then we did more of a instrumental synthesized, and we went into very abstract genre. This is not your common way of approaching a game unless you are somebody like Jason Graves who move between the genres in a fluid way. Most of the music that you encounter in games is a little bit more genre specific, but we already have different genres. So this is kind of an extra challenge here, right? How would you now fit anything from the early music to total abstract compositions and sound design into the game that you're designing? So without kind of really saying this explicitly, this is kind of an additional trick or additional level of sensibility and understanding of music that you will be required kind of to handle for your game. And in some of the comments to the homework, actually, I did point out or gave some little clues about, if you use a synthesizer which was chip-tuned, but your graphics was very photorealistic or contemporary, I mean, it might work. I mean, definitely today we blend everything, but you just need to be aware of that, okay? And think about this as a creator. So part of being a composer, being a designer, being an artist is being aware of some of that kind of history slash aesthetics that happened in this world. So I'm not saying necessarily you have to stick to these genres and conventions. Everything develops, and today we kind of free to use whatever we want. But it helps, and part of this class was actually showing you how these things evolved. And even if you go totally counter to these things, understanding where it comes from really helps. So deciding what genres and moods, and then trying to go and think like, okay, we have our musical assets. So now somehow we a little bit reduce the notion of the clips and the music that we created and just call them assets, just like, asset in a game where you can have, some graphic element, right? You build some kind of a tree and plant it somewhere, it's an asset. So intentionally kind of thinking about music as assets kind of suddenly kind of allows you to think about this differently. And then you kind of define, well, what is adaptive, what is not. So you can kind of think which things you want to actually be responsive to music. So openings usually are not responsive. You have elements like transitions and all kinds of dialogue or other elements that would be fixed. Maybe while you wait for a scene to load, or when you switch from a scene and you had to finish in a way that you couldn't synchronize them. So you basically pause the game. Something might be happening on the screen. You pause the interaction, and then the music has to play out. So thinking about these things, being aware of them, and eventually you go together. So you read through these points on your own, but you create your design document, or basically translate this into your objective asset, style, guide, interactivity. Go do this a couple of times until you kind of feel good about this. Then, in a real game situation, you would basically have to go and decide what are interaction controls. Are you doing switching? Are you mixing? Do you change the tempo depending on something that happens in the game? Do you do any effects, which we mentioned, but we're not going really to use them, and we definitely are not doing interactive games right now. Stinger and musical flourish, so these are kind of like fixed sound recordings that you might throw on top of your composition that something happens. If, again, if you discover some treasure, you will have some kind of boom. Okay, so that's a flourish, but it kind of links to the music. Yeah, you might think about these things. And if you have, I don't know, some kind of battle and swords are clashing, so of course you might trigger the sword sound, but you might also trigger some kind of a musical rendering of this thing. And this is where really the blend between sound effect and composition become strange, because if you take a concrete sound and then you make this into something which is really distorted or augmented or flourished, then it becomes a composition really. Changing instruments, arrangement, this is what we did in homework too. So all of these are opportunities or possibilities for you to create interaction with the musical material. Of course, you can also change the musical structure itself. You might change the chords. You can change the tonality. You might even switch melodies, or you can deliberately kind of create some new notes. If we have an engine like the Lexicon Sonata built into the game, you can think about lots of ways basically to generate music on the fly that will never repeat itself exactly. And people are kind of thinking about these things, so you can actually program, again, not for the final project, but as a possibility in the real world. So once you have this design document, you might want to go and be a little bit critical about this. So kind of go through these questions and see, and you might come up with your own set of questions, how to basically judge yourself once you start matching the music and your plan to kind of the rendering of the game. Now, again, this is just a suggestion of a working process. But I think the way I structured this, or the way others also suggest this, it's not just kind of my own way of inventing the work process. Is really just the materials themselves, and understanding the music, understanding the game and linking them, and then having some kind of a critical evaluation. So let me kind of go and show some examples of different ways of timing, synchronization, or working with cue lists. Okay, so cue to cue transitions, layering, and transition metrics. These are basically the three output kind of summary documents that will allow you to now start planning your game, or almost inputting this into game software if you were going that way. Um, so um, um, motivation about adaptive audio. It's a 9-minute video, so I'm not going to talk about, go through this whole video. You check it out, but basically it shows you how, by manipulating some elements of recordings and queuing them to specific events, you introduce the idea of adaptive audio. Now, middleware is really a software element that we will not, will not be actually studying or using in this class, but you're welcome to look into that on your own, or maybe I'll kind of demonstrate some ideas, but as an extra material. This is something that came up just from a technical need or perspective, and the idea was to release the burden or relieve the burden from of the programmers, of the game programmers, the burden of actually dealing with audio, because somehow you have people who know how to make graphics, people who make the logic of the game, and dealing with audio is kind of another domain that might be a little tricky, especially if you want some tools like audio, triggering audio, looping audio, adding some signal processing algorithm, and why would you want your programming team for a game to do everything if somebody can actually build a tool? So this is the middleware. And these were the goals, basically, kind of in a more specific way, like advantages that such a middleware accomplishes. Again, a lot of this is really just a technical thing. And the thing that it allows, because of the level of sophistication, and as this software continues developing, is that the music and the graphics become blended to an extent that they kind of work together as one entity. Now, just as sort of a comment or something to be aware of, we spoke about the idea that in the early days of the silent film, and when the movies became not silent anymore, some of the cinematographers, especially in more of the expressionism genre, felt that sound, in some sense, is reducing their ability to express themselves in terms of the visual aspects and the storytelling. That kind of sound brings us back to reality, which is funny. But I mean, like, for them, they could think about abstract images or manipulating the light and the black and white and the scenery, and exaggerate some of the acting. But if you introduce real sound, then kind of you dismiss that that spell. With adaptive audio, you actually have that flexibility that maybe the original audio recording didn't have. I mean, you could create these very distorted soundtracks and use them with the sound, but just being aware of the difficulty that going between sound, which is there is this term, we didn't cover this in the class, but so-called surrogate properties of the sound. And surrogate means, although I'm not sure this is kind of the most intuitive term or the right application, but once you hear door slam, you don't think about the beauty of the sounds, the sharp sound and maybe the low and then the trembling, whatever. And if the glass breaks, right, you don't think about this as frequencies, and it's not a percussion instrument. You actually think about here was a door that slammed and something broke. And that kind of reduces your ability to listen to the sound itself. And so there's even this concept of reduced listening that in abstract music people advocate for the ability to learn. And with this software, you kind of manipulate the sounds like we saw in sound design and sonic strategies that gives enough distortion for the sound so you would be able not only to refer to the meaning of the sound in the real world, the source, but actually listen to the sound in an abstract way. So maybe I kind of like show a short example of invisible so-called sound design, and just make sure I have the sound shared, and then we'll move on to the next section.
What I love. Hello, I'm Scruffy, and today I finally get to talk about a game that has changed my perception of what video games can do. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. The first time I played it, I was enthralled by how much there was to explore, how new approaches to combat and puzzles emerged from the game's married physics and chemistry engines, and how beautiful and creative the music and sound design got. There's so much detail and so much charm to this big world that many players have cherished over the past 2 years, but there are still more minute details that elude more players because they're not trying to stand out. And those are what I'd like to demonstrate today, specifically in the music mixing and sound effects of the game. They're called invisible design. Crafting a world to explore involves being very specific about what stands out in the world. If a mountain range stands out, it gives you an interesting destination to aim for. Meanwhile, minuscule things like running toward that mountain range don't stand out. Once you understand the controls, running on the ground remains pretty consistent and only imparts new information if the terrain happens to change. This is why it's called invisible. Your mind attunes to it and comes to expect less and less from its pattern, and so spends less attention on it until it's taken for granted. This is where developers can hide secret details that even subliminally get us more enriched in this game. If you don't mind noticing them, I'm going to show you a couple invisibly designed sounds, starting with things that were outright suggested in behind-the-scenes videos from the development team, and then getting to less noticeable things until the last item, something that, if you've noticed already...
So, I'll stop it here because you'll be watching this video on your own, but it kind of gives the same kind of idea, the same motivation, is that you can really start manipulating the sounds of everyday things in ways that become part of the sound design and change the perception of the player. A couple more examples of mixing, and specifically for virtual reality. Check out the Project Sandra, which is an audio implementation for a virtual reality world. And this kind of opens up another venue where it's clear that if you want to have some sort of a virtual reality event, even a social event like a party that happens in the virtual world, and you want to be able to kind of experience this almost as if it was real, you still have this ability to manipulate audio in ways that give this extra ambience, extra control. So this, the tools for mixing and streaming, combined with some of the middleware that can process and maybe trigger additional audio, is another domain where adaptive audio is going to be very important. Some references for additional or resources, and I would say the F-Mod, the Audiokinetic, and the Alias software, and some of the more kind of more elaborate tools that allow you to maybe include some AI into the music making. These are kind of more of the practical tools that exist today. So I hope this kind of method is going to be something that allows you to plan your way through the final project. Let me stop the recording and open this to questions.